Our first lecture was called Keeping Up with the Joneses. It involved Mr. D.F. Jones, Sr. and his family in his estate, which was called Fair Acres, which, to be quite honest, when we started, we thought it would be maybe one lecture. And we chose the Jones family for not just because Fair Acres happened to have 140 rooms. His name was very synonymous with the Swickley Heights area. The enormous influence that Jones and Laughlin had. But to be quite honest, the reason we started with the Jones family is we had the most information on the Jones family. We were fortunate enough that we had access to a lot of their family history, and as I said, as I did that first lecture, I started to realize that there were a lot of other extremely influential families that had a great deal to do with the development of Western Pennsylvania. So after doing the Jones and getting the response that we did, and as I said, seeing this turnout is fabulous, I can tell you, because it's it's quite a few faces I recognize, so I really appreciate the interest. And so that was the first lecture, the Joneses, and then it was the board decided that we try to turn this into a series of lectures, and that's how this has kind of evolved. And so we're trying to stick to maybe one lecture every 2 months. And so we did the Joneses, and then the next, as we tried to come to terms with how the series would evolve, we came up with the title On the Shoulders of Giants. Okay, and I think the original families that moved from largely Allegheny City, which we'll talk a little bit about as time goes on, up to this pristine area that was Swickley Heights, there were a tremendous number of remarkable coincidences that allowed for the migration to occur. First off, the fact that this property was still available as late as the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, really just a fluke occurrence. And we talked about that in this lecture on the Shoulders of Giants. It was largely for people who did not hear that lecture. This was called the Spanish Tract, the whole area that was Swickley Heights largely. And it was called that because the first family that owned basically a great deal of the Heights was the first governor of Pennsylvania. And he actually was called to, during the Revolutionary War time, he was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, got tied up. He had originally decided he bought the property and was going to parcel it off and sell it. He passed on, the Revolutionary War would happen, and passed it on to his daughter. And his daughter ended up marrying the person who became the ambassador in Spain. And so generations passed. They never got around to passing along the property, and it was still available. As these industrial families developed wealth, they had originally vacationed in other locations, and they found Swickley Heights and thought it was a great place to put some summer cottages, and that's how this basically evolved. And I think anybody who hasn't been here, taking the time to take a look around and see a lot of the photos, it's really worth your while. I mean, it was a remarkable time in history. So that was the second lecture. The third lecture involved Mr. Henry William Oliver and his family. And the reason we chose Mr. Oliver as our third lecture and his family was from what I've been able to find, he was really probably the impetus to get the families who decide to move up to the Heights area. He was a tremendous salesman, very charismatic figure, and again, with his associations, the Duquesne Club, and what I found, the group of people who decide to make their summer cottages up in Swickley Heights, their tie-ins were incredibly intricate and tight. Okay, they belonged to the same boards, and as the Industrial Revolution was occurring and Pittsburgh was developing into arguably the most influential city of its size in the country, these people not only, they did virtually everything together. They sat on boards together, they lunched at the Duquesne Club, the large majority of them lived in Allegheny City, which was, it's later become the North Shore. And that's really how, through all those connections, and it said there was a lot of intermarrying, they knew each other very well, the families interspersed, and so, again, but he got the first piece of property. That piece of property is really, whether it was considered Swickley Heights or not, that's where we come into a little gray area, but it's a property around where the YMCA is, the Swickley YMCA is now. And, but he was very instrumental. He tried to keep pushing families to consider Swickley Heights, the Swickley area for their summer homes, and he was able to accomplish that. Now, this next lecture, which we've chosen, and I do want to make a little apology and an appeal to the audience. The original lecture was titled The Byers and the Townsends. I was not able to find information on the Townsend family. So if anybody, I did have one individual told me about a relative and an heir was not able to make contact, that could not, from a historical standpoint. That's the bad news. The good news, I was very, very fortunate to be able to find a great deal of information on the Byers family. And at that point, the next picture, the gentleman who I was so fortunate enough to get the information from, Mr. Joe Byers, whom I assume is the gentleman on the far right, I assume. Okay, because I haven't met Mr. Byers myself, but through Cherry Semple and Carol Semple, they helped me get in contact with Mr. Byers, who happens to live in Ligonier and has lived a very remarkable life himself. And one of the things I want to do as this lecture series expands is try to find and talk about correlations between how Pittsburgh evolved and got to where we did in the Industrial Revolution and how it ties into today. So Mr. Byers was incredibly generous with family information. And as I said, I'm really looking forward to getting, hopefully, to meet Mr. Byers somewhere along the way. We're fortunate enough to have his son Brad here tonight, which is really nice. We have a little book for you here. It's the history of Swickley. I think your family might be mentioned in there. So but we really want to thank you very much for attending. And Mr. Byers shared an enormous amount of information. So I'm going to be able to this time in this lecture a little more, and I think it'll be a little different than some of the others. I can take the history of the Byers family from fairly early up to almost the present. And so that's what I'm going to try to do, and I'll try to keep this moving along pretty quickly. Okay? When we tell the story of Swickley Heights and do any research into the history of Swickley Heights, it really starts with Allegheny City. Okay, Allegheny City was what was the old north side, what was now currently the north side and the North Shore. But virtually every family, or not every, but a huge number of families that eventually moved up to Swickley Heights lived in the Allegheny City community. The Byers family actually had one of the largest houses built right near the end of when what was called Millionaires Row was evolving in Allegheny City. And this picture is taken somewhere around the turn of the century. But again, the families that lived within really a walking distance of each other around that time before they moved up to the Heights, the Carnegie family, the Jones family, the Hines family, the Snyder's family, the Byers family, scientific families like the Brashears and the Langleys, and those names, and this is something that I will mention over and over again. The names I've read about are names in the city of Pittsburgh that if you've lived here for a little while, you'll realize these are names that you recognize. They also had, again, aside from that, there was the artistic side. Writers like Mary Roberts Reinhardt, Martha Graham, and again, as I mentioned before, having got to go to Swiftly Academy even as late as the 70s when I graduated, so many of these names, which I didn't even realize, were the people I went to high school with, their children and heirs. So it's continued as we've moved along. So again, as I said, what got these families to consider Swiftly Heights, the fact that they were interconnected, knew each other so closely, in a time where they could literally walk to work. And the interesting thing about Allegheny City, it was actually incorporated as a town in 1840, and by 1900, it was the third largest city in Pennsylvania, before it was annexed by Pittsburgh. And at that same time, by 1900, 44, well, termed Millionaires Row, 44 families at that time, already by the turn of the century, worth $1 million. And that dwarfed the number of millionaires in Pittsburgh. So this was the area where people decided to live and congregate. And the patriarch of the Byers family, from where the story gets started, was Alexander McBurney Byers, And he was born in 1827 in Mercer County. And really, on like so many of the stories of the young industrialists, wasn't formally educated, but had a tremendous work ethic. And by the time he was 16, he was already working for a company called the Henry Clay Furnace Company, and already worked into a point where he had a reasonable amount of management responsibility, even at the age of 16. He married a woman named Martha Fleming. They had a number of children, and he went from the Henry Clay Company, and the first investment he made personally as he developed some assets was in a company that was made a partner of the Spang Chalfant Company, and that was his first contact with the iron and steel industry. And there's a little picture of his first company, A.M. Byers, a wrought iron pipe company. It was established in 1864. As you can see, it was on the south side of Pittsburgh. And they had a second company in Girard, Ohio, under the same type of concept, iron pipe and things to that effect. He actually lived in Allegheny City until they built their house in the late 1800s. Unfortunately, he only got to live in the house, which was about 100 rooms. We'll see that house next. There we go. There's the house, the Byers house in Allegheny City. He and his wife lived in one part of it. His daughter and son-in-law, J. Dennison Lyon, lived in the other half of the house. Unfortunately, Mr. Byers only lived there a couple years before he passed. His wife lived there for a little while longer. And it was his son that lived there for a while, Frederick Byers, if I understand right, who, as he lived there for a period of time, he was the Byers. Mr. Byers had decided to start building a house up in Swiftly Heights, but really didn't get to live up there until one of his sons moved up. Now Here's some pictures of the interior of the home. Very fortunate. And just so you know, this house still is standing. This home is still standing, and it's actually part of Allegheny Community College. So you can actually go see it. It's called the Byers Hall, I believe, Byers Live Hall, and you can still take tours of it. So, and it was nice enough to share with me that I think Mr. Byers mentioned that there's a lot of stories that the house is actually haunted. You know, so you can take tours. I'm not sure what it leads to, but certainly a lot. Having gone to a small liberal arts school myself, a lot of the old buildings, I can appreciate where you could view them as haunted. Okay. So one of the other things that the Byers family and the patriarch, Mr. Alexander McBurney Byers, he was one of a number of the industrial families that developed a tremendous interest in the arts and in artwork in particular. And he developed what was considered to be possibly the finest collection of artwork near the end of his life that he had on the piece of property on the North Shore. He really developed this collection with help from a couple dealers in both Paris and New York City between about 1888 and about 1900. This collection has been pretty much kept intact from what I understand, and it was at the Carnegie Institute up at least until the late 1950s. It was on continuous loan to the Carnegie Institute on the North Shore. That's where I lost contact with it, and I'm not sure how the artwork has gotten dispersed since then. But it had, he had a Rembrandt, from what I understand. He had some of the finest pieces of art from a wide variety of the top artists in the world. And if I understand right, I think we have a tremendous amount more information on this collection in a video at the History Center here if you have more if you have more interest in this. Okay, and there's another one of the pieces of art. Okay, then now we're going to get to a little more recent history. Okay, and this is Mr. J. Frederick Byers. This Mr. Byers, okay, again, he took over. Now, if I understand right, is this your grandfather?
My great-grandfather.
Your great-grandfather. Okay, your great-grandfather, J. Frederick Byers. He took over the family company, carried on, did a lot of very interesting things, and at that point, I believe the Byers company continued to expand. And that he's the individual who actually moved up to Goodwood, which is the family home up here in Swickley Heights. Goodwood it was named actually because of the type of trees that grew on the property, and it was called Goodwood because of the biblical connection. It was the same type of wood that was used on the cross for Jesus. So. Again, the house was, about 100 rooms, stayed in existence for quite a while. After the Byers family decided to move out, I believe it was sold to the Heinz heir. Okay, and then sadly, I think as time went on, a lot of these old mansions became too expensive to take care of. But in this case, this particular piece of property, I think it went from the Heinz family to Mr. Simmons, the chairman of the board of Allegheny Technologies, and he decided to build his own home in the property. So here's some of the pictures of the Goodwood interior. is. It's a shame that more of these pieces of property were not able to be maintained. It really is as time has gone on. Okay, here's some more pictures of the interior. Now, if there's any questions as I move along, please don't hesitate to jump in. Okay, now we're going to get to some more recent history.
You got a question?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
That's okay. I was going to ask him what year, thank you, it was built and what year it was demolished, if you know.
The year it was built was right in the early 1900s. I believe they moved into the house about 1910. Okay, and it was demolished, I think, was about maybe the 1980s, possibly, right in that vicinity. So.
But isn't the carriage house still there?
The original carriage house?
It's for sale.
Good for sale.
Okay, right, it's still there and it's for sale. That's a good thing because again, all the Byers family, not unlike, and you'll see as I get into a little more modern history, what was so different about that time, I think, than what has occurred in the more recent past, we've become so much more specialized as a society. These families, combined all aspects of life. Their business side, their personal side, their athletic side, recreation, whatever you want to call it. But they were extremely competitive people, extremely competitive families. And they competed in business, they competed, in other aspects. But they also tremendously, so many of these families, sports was a big, huge activity, and the sports that were really popular, and this is how, other ways that evolved for how the families moved up to the heights. In Allegheny City, one of the first things the families did was put the Allegheny Country Club together, which was named, I'm sure, because it was started in 1895 in Allegheny City. And you can only picture this in your mind, but they actually put a golf course in what is now the North Shore. And it only fits 6 holes. And there's interesting stories about this at every turn. One was when they got up to Swickley Heights, and I'm not sure exactly who it was, but the story goes that one of the gentlemen bet another gentleman that it would take whatever number of shots with the golf, with the golf clubs and the balls of the day. I think it would make like 550 shots to get from Swickley Heights to the building in Pittsburgh. Which struck me as interesting because I could only picture from the families in the areas and the situation. And we're fortunate enough to have some people in this room that were phenomenal golfers. And there's a rule that, and I'm sure it's a rule that these people honor tremendously. You play the ball where it lied. And so we're going to start in Swickley Heights and play the ball where it lied, and the finish of the hole is somewhere in downtown Pittsburgh. You can only picture where that ball ended up. A lot of times, and I picture this in my head when I'm telling these stories. And when I was able to dig up, the ball managed to get in people's houses, in barns, and that's where the gentleman played it. But he did win his bet. Whatever he said, he could do it in like 550 some shots. He did it in about 480 some shots. So he won a very, important personal bet with the other gentleman. So anyway, so now we're going to move on to a little more recent history. Evan Byers here, he was, again, as Allegheny Country Club moved up to Swickley Heights, Evan Byers was probably most known. He was a young man. He went to Yale. The Byers family had a lot of connections with Yale University, as did a number of the other industrial families. So much so that the Byers family, they donated when the one son passed around 1900. I'm not sure off the top of my head which son was. They donated a reasonable amount of money for a religious hall at Yale. It's still called Byers Hall. It's still at Yale. But anyway, so Evan went to Yale. He was a very good amateur golfer at Yale, and he became, probably the first legendary golfer in Western Pennsylvania. He was an amateur. He actually he played in what was called the U.S. Amateur. It still has that now. He didn't win in like 1901 or 1902, but in 1906 and 1907 he won the U.S. Amateur, and he was a very much a legendary figure in the area. He always remained a bachelor, and he had a very kind of tragic ending to his life. Evan, I guess, has some injuries. I don't know if they're related whatsoever to his athletic, his sporting endeavors. I mean, he also was a race car driver, such as whatever race cars were available at that time. He was a horseman, so participated in a lot of different activities. I guess he had a shoulder injury or an arm injury, and for whatever reason, the recommended medicine or whatever, give him a chance to heal and live a healthier life, involved a mixture of radium and water called Radicon. And he took this, and sadly, he died of toxic poisoning. And I think at the age of about 51. And my interest, one of my interests in that story would be what would have motivated. I don't know if I'm an ex-athlete myself. Was he taking it because he still wanted to be athletically active, or was he in pain? And however it occurred, but it was really a national story, and it was covered in the national newspapers phenomenally. And thank goodness, after he passed from this, and from what I understand, it was not a comfortable death. They took it off the market, thank goodness. And I think so we learned something from that. So now we get to a little more. Now this is Buck Byers. This is
my grandfather.
Your grandfather, there we go. And then I'm not sure where this picture was taken, but again, I included this picture. It very well could be up in either Ligonier or Brooklyn Heights. But again, it kind of gives you an indication of the families. The Olivers are still a very influential family, obviously, in Western Pennsylvania. And yeah, so the family connections, and there's a picture of Brad's grandfather when he was a young man. And then your father, right?
No, it's my grandfather.
This is your grandfather.
And my grandmother.
Right? This is your grandfather, okay. And the reason I'm going to start including this is because, again, I do want to get back to the connection between the development that we talk about, we're talking about on the shoulders of giants, and how it has influenced the present, and still influences the present. And I find this, and there's a little story that I'll share that I find very apropos to this this particular lecture. I don't know if any of you watch a TV show called This Is Us or have heard of it. Okay, it's supposedly set here in Western Pennsylvania. And I think it does a great job. It's something that my wife and I and my couple of my daughters just love, and we watch it every week religiously, pretty much. There isn't many things we watch like that, but it's a story about a family, and it predates about my time, but I can identify with it. It's probably the main characters are about late 50s or early 60s in Western Pennsylvania, 1950s or 1960s. And if you recall that time, in my recollection, it wasn't a great time for the city. The mills were starting to close. Our best times appeared to be somewhat behind us, And my argument now will be also hopefully in front of us also. But the two main characters, the woman, the mother of the show, wanted to be a singer. And so she somehow gets an audition in Los Angeles. Her partner in the show later becomes the husband and the father in the show. They decide to drive to LA to get this audition for her to sing. Okay, and she makes this trip out all the way to LA to sing for this producer. And she gives it her best shot, and the producer says, "That was great." You know, she said, "Well, that's good to hear. So what can I expect from this?" You know, so don't worry, we'll call you. You know, we'll call you. We'll let you know what to do. And she's walking, she turns around and says, "You know, I don't know what you're saying. What do you mean by that? Are you going to actually call me, or are you not going to call me?" And he said, "Well, listen, young lady, you know, just out of curiosity, where did you drive from for this audition?" Okay, and she said, "Pittsburgh." Okay, and he said, "Well, let me tell you, you're Pittsburgh good." Okay? And that's, I think people have lived through that time in our history. Believe me, it wasn't meant as a compliment at that point. Okay? I think the purpose, one of my bigger purposes in doing this and in this lecture series, the families we're talking about, you know, when we say we're on the shoulders of giants, these families took Pittsburgh to a place where when you said you were Pittsburgh good, it wasn't an insult. It was a compliment at the highest level. Okay? And I think the point of the story for me is that I truly believe that what these families did before, and I give them a phenomenal, it's not just these families, but the tens of thousands, 100,000, even 1 million or more immigrants who came to Pittsburgh and developed Pittsburgh to make maybe one of the most, arguably the most influential city of its size during the world wars, where these industrialists, we had to run our mills around the clock to make sure that, you know, the Allies could win these wars. You know, these are the stories, okay, that made Pittsburgh great. But at the root of these, and this is what I found from Brad's father, and I see it in so many people that I've had the good fortune to meet who have been accomplished, and then the people that worked in the mills. There's something really special about Western Pennsylvania. Okay, it was just, these people love the area. They could have chosen a lot of other areas to develop their businesses. The families that moved here, so many of the immigrant families with the different locations in the city as they worked in the mills, they developed their communities. The communities lasted. And the important thing to note is that these people, you know, the Byers, the Snyders, the Joneses, the Carnegies, the Hineses, okay, they could have taken their money and done a lot of different things with it. What they did is they developed foundations, they invested in libraries, they invested in universities, they invested in hospitals, and under the radar, that lasted through the tough times, and we're starting to see the payoffs again. And because of that, it's people like my children, for the first time when I worked in the city 20, 30, 40 years ago, we go out at lunch. At that time, you didn't see a young face anywhere around. Now you go into the city, there's young people, we can compete at the highest level again. So the goal is that we do the same thing when they say you're Pittsburgh good, it carries the same weight. It's purely good. It's not meant in any sense of the word as being not at the highest level. So again, that's pretty much. Now, any further questions? Let's see here. There's just a couple. Oh, here we go. Yes, Mr. Buck Byers just had to wrap up with the connections to where we are today. There's a picture of the gentleman with Mr. Reagan, Mr. Byers. The Byers family has been very active in very recent political history. It goes further than that. Here's a picture. Now here's a story that was shared with me, and it's kind of a heartwarming. There's a number of heartwarming stories about this. Okay, this gentleman was actually the finance manager for President George H.W. Bush, Mr. Byers. Okay, it gives you an idea of the time and how certain things have, hopefully not changed forever, but only changed a little bit. Mr. Byers' wife passed, I got the story right, when Mr. Bush was vice president. She passed, I'm not sure what she passed of. He was actually on Air Force 2 at the time. And from what I was told by Mr. Byers, within a couple hours, the phone rang from Air Force 2, and Vice President Bush was offering his condolences, which is just, I find those stories to be fabulous. And there's a sad end to that story also. There's a number of sad stories. He was the finance manager when Vice President Bush finally won the election I can't remember off the top of my head what year was that, 1980, I think? When Mr. Bush won the presidency, or 84. But anyways, he was going to be on the inauguration stage, and he had some sort of massive physical problem. Never actually got to be on the stage, and he passed pretty quickly at that point, before so much of his efforts showed fruition with Vice President Bush, who became President Bush. So, and again, it just shows the connection, how powerful these connections are. And that is it. That's a wrap for tonight. Are there any questions, any follow-up? Go, yes, sir.
What happened to the original company?
Okay, good question. The original company stayed in existence until, again, the years off the top of my head, it might have been late 60s or 70s.
60s.
60s, okay, late 60s. It was a wrought iron pipe company, and it was probably the largest wrought iron pipe company in the world at the time. Now, wrought iron has a very specific purpose. It's a metal, and I've had this explained to it. It conducts heat different than a lot of other metals. It's made for pipes. So what it was used for was to, for example, keep ice skating rinks or runways heated so they don't ice over. I'm sure there's wrought iron furniture, things to that effect. But it was, again, the hard times came. There was, becoming a more and more specialty area, and the company decided they had to sell, or they were looking for some alternatives to what could be done. So the original company, and this is another interesting story, they didn't know how this was going to play out. And if I got the story again right, was your grandmother or your
Grandmother.
Your grandmother,
No.
who said, look, I know this gentleman at General Tire and Rubber. You may want to give these people a call, because they make pipe too. And now your grandmother wasn't college educated, if I understand right, or anything to that effect. But that's where the mesh came together. And there's some stories. The negotiations were, from what I understand, very difficult. It was also very difficult for the family because of the layoffs that were going to occur, a number of different things. But eventually the company was sold to General Tire. Actually, when the negotiations were coming, they were hitting kind of a brick wall. grandfather decided it might be good that if the main negotiators took a trip to home in Florida, the family had a home in Florida, spent about a week together, they got along really well, and the deal went through. So that's what happened to the original company. So, any other questions?
I have one question, but not in regards to that. Tim, that picture up there of Pittsburgh,
Correct.
is there anyone here that knows what year that was or around what year?
This one?
Yeah.
That's a good question. It's called early Pittsburgh.
I don't recognize any buildings at all, so.
I would hazard.
Or bridges, even the Smithfield Street bridges is there.
Right. I would say that's, I mean, Dana, I would say that might be the early 1900s. Would that be a?
1912.
1912, very good. Wait, it's not listed 1912, that makes sense because of the nature of where everything was at that point. And the point was actually pretty much an industrial area. Pretty much an industrial area. That's a very good question because it's a great lead-in because that's why, this history center exists. These pictures, they tell a story, and it's worth, if anybody has interest in history. Oh, and I will wrap up with a couple quick things, a little side list. If you have a sincere interest in having a better understanding of the history of both Western Pennsylvania, this is definitely the book to either borrow or I don't know if it's just called Pittsburgh, the Story of an American City. It really takes Western Pennsylvania from before the Revolutionary War, well before the Revolutionary War, up to almost the present. We have a copy of it, and certainly I'm sure we'd be willing to lend to that, but it's the group of people who wrote this history, it is pretty remarkable. It's actually, the first version came out during Lyndon Johnson's administration. I don't know if it was Mayor Lawrence who gave it to President Johnson for a read. He actually read it in 3 days, and he called back to complain to the mayor. He said, you took me away from official business because I've been reading about Pittsburgh for 3 days. And I can tell you, I could hardly explain how much I learned about the city in that book, and again, how many correlations are occurring. Now, on the specific things we've talked about, and they're less heavy reading. If you want a little information on Allegheny City in particular, and how it influenced Western Pennsylvania, this book was actually written by one of the premier historians currently still alive in Western Pennsylvania, and her name is Carol Peterson. But the co-author, somebody you may recognize, who was a Western Pennsylvania, Allegheny City person till he passed on, Dan Rooney. Okay. And again, it just gives an indication of how these families have kept this history alive. A smaller, easier read, but gets you through the same thing as Allegheny City from 1840 to 1907. So a lot of information that wasn't personal for today's lecturers ever get from these books. So, okay, any other questions? I really want to thank you for your time and your patience. Then we'll just, we'll decide on who we're going to do in our next lecture for the end of January.